Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Marcus Mercer saw when he watched her spill coffee across the shift change report at 11:47 p.m. The cup had slipped from her trembling fingers when the overhead page crackled, code blue, trauma bay 3, and the brown liquid soaked through 3 pages of vital signs before anyone moved. Mercer noticed the tremor. He didn't notice that those same hands would steady a laceration with the precision of a master sculptor within the hour. He didn't notice the folded flag hidden in her locker. He had no idea that Captain Megan O'Brien, 3 months into Cedar Creek Medical's night shift rotation, had held more lives together than he'd saved in 28 years of climbing the hospital hierarchy. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Cedar Creek Medical occupied a converted industrial district in Norfolk, all beige linoleum and fluorescent lights that buzzed like angry insects trapped in plastic domes. The ER smelled of antiseptic and burnt coffee and something underneath, the copper-tinted copper scent of trauma. Megan had worked here for 91 days. She'd counted. The night shift suited her. Fewer questions. Fewer eyes. Fewer people who might notice that a trauma nurse in the ICU monitor station didn't quite fit the baseline of a trauma nurse, the way she moved between patients like a chess player calculating 5 moves ahead, the way her voice dropped an octave when things went critical, the way she touched her stethoscope sometimes like a soldier checking a sidearm. She was 5'8", built lean from years of work that had never been listed on a resume. Her hands bore the calluses of someone who'd done things hands shouldn't have to do. A thin scar ran the length of her right forearm, a story she never told. Her left leg had a slight limp she favored when fatigue set in, the kind of injury that civilians attributed to car accidents or falls. Megan let them. The truth lived elsewhere. Her dark hair was pulled into a regulation bun, and her scrubs were standard hospital blue, unremarkable in every way except for the precision with which she tucked them. Military corners on her locker at home. Military precision in her work. Military discipline in her silence. Dr. Mercer was waiting at the nurse's station when she clocked in. He stood with the posture of a man who'd never questioned his place in the world, shoulders back, chin elevated, the kind of casual dominance that came from 30 years of being the smartest person in every room. His white coat bore the insignia of senior attending, and his name badge included the subheading Physician of Record, which meant something to him. It meant that his orders moved the hospital. His decisions were final. His authority was absolute. Megan had learned within her first week that Dr. Mercer did not tolerate nurses who operated outside the invisible lane they'd been assigned to drive in. The shift change briefing was chaos, 3 trauma cases incoming from a multi-vehicle on I-64, 2 stable ICU admits waiting for bed assignment, and Sergeant Dawson in the recovery wing, still groggy from this afternoon's post-operative sedation. Megan had been monitoring Sergeant Dawson since he'd arrived 2 months ago. Shrapnel wounds from an IED in Baghdad. Pulmonary complications from the secondary blast. He was improving daily, the kind of steady recovery that felt like a victory. He was also the commanding officer of her son's unit. That detail lived in her chest like a stone. When the page came, code blue, trauma bay 3, the charge nurse was on the phone. The resident was already scrubbed in with a laceration repair. The attending on call was Dr. Mercer, who was standing 8 feet away, reviewing charts with the kind of absorbed focus that meant he was about to ignore the page for another 30 seconds. Megan's hands moved. The coffee cup went down. 1 pour. 1 spill. 1 moment of calculated visibility. She stood, stepped toward the trauma bay, then hesitated, waited exactly 2 seconds for Mercer to acknowledge her with a wave of dismissal before moving forward. The perfect picture of deference. Of knowing her place. The trauma case was a 19-year-old male with a deep laceration across the cheekbone, knife wound, probably, though nobody was saying, and he was bleeding steadily but not catastrophically. Manageable. The kind of case that could turn ugly in 8 minutes if nobody was watching vitals, or it could stabilize in 12 if someone tracked the bleed pattern and anticipated the fluid loss. Megan grabbed her tray. The trauma surgeon, not Mercer, thank God, was already calling out orders. Sutures. Typo negative standing by. Pressure here. Release. Chart the bleed rate. Her hands moved on their own. Sutures had texture. The needle was platinum-coated titanium, delicate as whispered breath, and her fingers found the weight of it the way a violinist finds a string they haven't touched in years. The thread was silk, 5-0, fine enough to hold together the delicate tissue around an eye without puckering the skin. In. Out. In. Out. No hesitation. No wasted movement. The stitches were even, 7 mm apart, identical depth, the kind of closure that would heal without visible scar tissue. The trauma surgeon glanced at her hands. Paused. Looked back at the work. She'd seen that look before. It meant recognition. It meant someone had just watched a nurse who had trained like a surgeon work with surgical precision. By 1:15 a.m., the patient was stable, discharged to ICU hold, and Megan was washing her hands in the scrub sink when Dr. Mercer appeared in the doorway. His reflection was visible in the stainless steel mirror. He watched her for 4 seconds without speaking. The fluorescent light above them buzzed like a saw blade cutting through wood. Then he said, "Make sure you're charting the attending's decisions correctly, O'Brien. Not your own interpretations." She didn't turn around. "Yes, doctor." The water was hot enough to turn her skin pink. She let it run. "Just want to be clear about scope." "Understood, doctor." She felt him leave before she heard him move. By 2 a.m., the ICU rounds were complete. Megan did her final check of Sergeant Dawson's monitor, sinus rhythm, steady, oxygen saturation at 97% on room air. His color was improving. The wound sites were healing without infection. He'd be cleared for transfer to civilian recovery in another week, and then he'd go back to the base, and then to his command, and her son would be in better hands than most soldiers ever got. That was the assignment. Not to heal the sergeant. To ensure the sergeant healed. To be his monitor. His guardian. His shadow. The detail was classified for levels above most military hospitals could access, and Norfolk didn't have a clue that the trembling nurse in the ICU was actually a captain with a service record that would take 6 hours to read aloud. Her locker was in the break room, tucked in the corner where evening shift nurses never ventured. She opened it at 2:34 a.m., during the breath before the next wave. The photograph was still there of her son, David, 17 years old, standing in his rock dress uniform at Charleston High School. His shoulders were already broad. His eyes were already serious. She'd been on a classified operation in Kandahar when he turned 16. She'd been in a military hospital in Landstuhl when he graduated. She'd been here, in Cedar Creek Medical in Norfolk, when he'd walked across the stage to accept his appointment to the Naval Academy. She could see him once a week during the assigned rotation. She could attend his ROTC ceremonies in plain clothes as a civilian observer. She could not tell him why she was here. She could not explain that her assignment was to ensure his commanding officer, the man responsible for his safety, remained stable enough to command. The stone in her chest tightened. Below the photograph was the folded flag. Not the American flag. This one was smaller, dyed in desert colors, bearing the insignia of the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, and the name tape of Sergeant First Class Daniel Holloway. Holloway had been her partner for 4 years. 2 tours in Helmand Province. 1 tour in Anbar. He died in her arms at Forward Operating Base Shank, his blood warm against her hands while she pushed through the chest wall to find the wound the initial assessment had missed. The flag was the only piece of him she'd been allowed to keep. She touched it once, just enough to feel the fabric, and then she closed the locker. Dr. Mercer was reviewing her personnel file when she passed his office on the way to the parking lot at 6:45 a.m. She knew he was reviewing it because the file was open on his screen, the pages visible through the glass partition. Her file was thin. 3 months of employment. References that checked out. Credentials that were flawless. Certifications that were current. Education that was solid, BSN from the University of Virginia, continuing education in trauma nursing, CPR instructor rating, advanced life support certification. Everything was clean. Everything was designed to be invisible. But Mercer was smart. He was competent. He'd built his career on the principle that nurses who performed above their station were dangerous to the hierarchy, and Megan O'Brien had just performed trauma-level sutures in front of a trauma surgeon without breaking a sweat. The danger bells were ringing in his brain. She could see it in the tightness of his jaw when she walked past his office. "O'Brien." His voice stopped her in the hallway. She turned. "Yes, doctor. Something's off about your background." Not a question. An observation. She met his eyes, a nurse meeting an attending, deferential, open, nothing to hide. "I'm not sure I understand, doctor." His fingers drummed once on the desktop. That fine motor control. That composure. "You've worked trauma before." "Yes, doctor. Level 1 center in DC for 2 years before I transferred here." A lie that was documented in the file. A hospital that would verify it. A resume that would hold under scrutiny because the military intelligence apparatus had built it to hold under scrutiny. "Where did you learn to suture like that?" "Practice, doctor." Hospital protocol encourages competency across all nursing stations. Another lie. Another truth nested inside it. She had learned to suture while performing field operations on soldiers whose names she'd never know, whose family she'd never meet, whose death she'd learned to carry the way she carried Sergeant Holloway's flag, carefully, silently, folded so the pain would take up as little space as possible. Mercer studied her for 8 seconds. The fluorescent lights buzzed above his office like insects trapped in plastic. "You'll be under observation, O'Brien. I need to ensure you're not overstepping your scope." "Understood, doctor. Thank you for the feedback." She was already moving, not away from him, which would seem like retreat, but toward the time clock, which was her exit vector. Professional. Deferential. Exactly what a nurse should be when a physician reminded her of her place in the hierarchy. He didn't see what was underneath. Nobody ever did. Not until it was too late. She clocked out at 6:52 a.m., walked to her car, and sat in the parking lot with her hands on the steering wheel, breathing in the salt air from Norfolk Harbor, feeling the stone in her chest expand with the weight of everything she couldn't say. What happened next would change everything. But first, Megan had 5 more hours of sleep before she returned to Cedar Creek Medical, and the next time she did, someone was going to need her hands. Megan's hands moved through the vital signs check with the precision of someone who'd performed this ritual 1,000 times before. Sergeant Dawson lay in bed his chest rising and falling in the shallow pattern that made her jaw tighten. Shortness of breath. Elevated heart rate at 118. Blood pressure creeping upward, 146/92. The signs were screaming, but only if you knew how to listen. She'd learned to listen in places where ignoring whispers got people killed. "How are we feeling this morning, Sergeant?" Her voice came out soft, deferential, the voice of a nurse who knew her place. The mask fit so well now she sometimes forgot she was wearing it. "Fine." His breathing caught on the last word. Fine. The universal lie of soldiers everywhere. She'd told that same lie 100 times, bleeding in desert sand while telling her commanding officer everything was tactically sound. She checked his oxygen saturation on the monitor. 91%. 2 days ago it had been 97. The dip was subtle enough that most people wouldn't notice. Most people weren't trained to read the spaces between numbers where danger lived. His wife sat in the bedside chair, Mrs. Dawson, or Jennifer, with her hands folded in her lap like she was praying. 3 days of hospital visits had worn her down to the nub. Her eyes tracked Megan's movements the way civilians did when they sensed competence but didn't trust it. Megan adjusted the fall line, noting the slight swelling in his right calf. Asymmetrical. She'd need to check it properly, but not here. Not in front of anyone. She pulled the blanket down to his feet with the casual ease of routine care, and there it was, a subtle fullness on the right side that his left leg didn't mirror. Deep vein thrombosis, probably. The clot upstream was obvious now if you knew what you were seeing. A piece of it had broken loose and traveled to his lungs. Pulmonary embolism. Massive one, given the oxygen drop. The knowledge sat in her chest like a stone. I'm going to run a quick lab, Sergeant. Just checking your blood work from yesterday. She didn't ask Dr. Mercer. That was the mistake she needed to make. She found Mercer in the hallway outside reviewing a chart with the casual arrogance of a man who'd spent 30 years being right and mistaken that for wisdom. His posture changed when he saw her, shoulders squaring, eyes narrowing by a fraction. She'd become a problem for him. A nurse who noticed things. A nurse whose hands moved with the fluid certainty of someone trained to handle catastrophe. A threat. Doctor. She kept her voice respectful, a question wrapped in deference. The D-dimer came back on Sergeant Dawson. 2.4. His face didn't change. That was the terrifying part, the absolute absence of reaction. Like a hunter who'd just realized something wasn't right about the prey. Who ordered that test, nurse? I did, sir. Based on the clinical presentation. You did. He said it like she'd confessed to stealing. His voice dropped, the temperature in the hallway shifting like pressure before a storm. Did I order that test? No, doctor, but... Then you overstepped. He moved past her, back toward the room, and she followed because the protocol demanded she follow. Because Mrs. Dawson was in that room and she needed to see what was about to happen. Needed to understand that the system would protect itself before it protected her husband. Mercer stood at the foot of the bed, his presence suddenly filling the small room like something with weight and mass. Jennifer Dawson's spine went rigid. Mrs. Dawson, I apologize for this nurse's delusions of competence. His words came out smooth, rehearsed, a performance he'd practiced. Nurse O'Brien seems to believe she has the authority to order diagnostic tests on my patients. She doesn't. She's a registered nurse, not a physician, and she doesn't have the training to make clinical judgments. Megan watched Jennifer's face crumple with confusion. Sergeant Dawson's jaw clenched. The D-dimer shows pulmonary embolism, Megan said. Her voice was level. The mask stayed in place. He needs a CT angiogram immediately. Mercer's head turned toward her with the slow precision of a weapon tracking. You don't order diagnostic tests. You empty bedpans and follow my orders. You follow protocols established by physicians who actually have medical degrees. He turned back to Mrs. Dawson. I'll order the imaging. As a precaution. But this is an example of scope creep that undermines the entire medical hierarchy. You can't have nurses practicing medicine. Megan felt the calculation running through her neural pathways, the cold machinery of combat training assessing the geometry of the room, the distance to the door, the potential for escalation. She forced herself to breathe. To stay present in her body rather than retreat into the part of her brain that knew how to survive. One measured breath. A tear traced her cheek. She didn't know how it got there, her eyes produced it without permission from her consciousness. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Mercer. Held his gaze the way a soldier holds ground. I've performed under worse pressure than your insecurity, Doctor. The silence stretched like a living thing. Jennifer Dawson's breath caught. Sergeant Dawson's head turned to stare at his nurse. Mercer's face went the color of overripe fruit, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Megan stepped back from the bed, her movements controlled and precise. The imaging will confirm the diagnosis. He'll need anticoagulation. She addressed Mrs. Dawson directly. Your husband is going to be fine. The treatment is straightforward. She was out of the room before Mercer could find his voice. The next morning, a written reprimand appeared on the unit board in red marker that looked like it had been pressed so hard into the paper it nearly tore through. RNM the Brian, written warning for insubordination and overstepping scope of practice. The words were framed in a box, impossible to miss, impossible to ignore. Megan read it while the other nurses pretended not to watch her read it. Two of them turned and walked toward the supply room. Another busied herself with charting. The message was clear and surgical: she was a problem. Contagion. The CT angiogram that Mercer had reluctantly ordered came back showing massive pulmonary embolism with at least 3 clots visible in the right main pulmonary artery. The kind of finding that would have killed Sergeant Dawson within hours if untreated. Her diagnosis had saved his life. Mercer didn't apologize. He adjusted the anticoagulation protocol and moved on with the administrative precision of a man whose pride was worth more than acknowledgement. Over the next week, the physics of the unit shifted. The break room became a hostile space. Megan would sit with her lunch, always brought from home, never purchased from the hospital cafeteria where she might be forced to make small talk, and within moments, the room would empty. Nurses she'd worked with for 3 months, nurses whose hand she'd steadied during difficult placements, would stand and leave within seconds of her sitting down. She could hear them in the hallway. Could hear the whispers about credentials and falsification. Mercer had done this with surgical precision, a campaign of character assassination that required almost no effort because people were predisposed to believe it. A nurse who was too skilled must have gotten her skill somewhere unauthorized. A woman who spoke with authority must be overstepping. A person who could read a D-dimer like scripture must be practicing medicine without a license. During morning rounds, with 8 staff members present, Mercer delivered his final wound. "I've contacted the state board to verify Nurse O'Brien's credentials." He said it casually, between reviewing Mrs. Patterson's labs and discussing Mr. Chen's medication adjustment. Sometimes people embellish their qualifications. It happens more often than administration wants to admit. "We're just being thorough." The implication hung in the sterile air like something poisoned. Megan stood in the corner of the workstation, holding a stack of charts, and said nothing. Her hands were completely steady. Her breathing was completely regular. The tremor that the observer might have noticed wasn't fear, it was restraint. It was a body trained to respond to threats, held in check by a mind trained to think longer than it wanted to fight. That night, she sat at the nurse's station at 2:02 a.m. when the hospital was in that deep quiet between the late-night chaos and the pre-dawn shift rush. Through the vent slots in her locker, she could see the folded flag. The edges were worn smooth from 17 years of being moved, hidden, carried across continents. It had belonged to Lieutenant Colonel James Hayworth, who'd bled out in her arms in a phi base outside Fallujah while she applied pressure to a wound that was too large to close. Her son's commanding officer. The man who'd promised to keep her boy safe. The same man sleeping 6 rooms down the hallway, his blood now thin with anticoagulants, his lungs clear, his life bought with her hands and her diagnosis and her willingness to stand in front of a physician's authority and say, "Not on my watch." 2 weeks later, Sergeant Dawson was scheduled for discharge. He moved without the careful shuffling of a cardiac patient, his color good, his oxygen saturation holding steady at 96%. Megan performed her rounds with the same deferential competence, checking his dressing changes, monitoring his wounds, noting that the small laceration on his left shoulder had been cleaned with the precision of someone who knew that infection could be as lethal as any explosion. She was checking his vitals at 2:15 p.m. when his body stiffened. His mouth opened. His lips went the color of slate. The sound came first, a wet, strangled gasp that made every alarm in the room fire simultaneously. Blood pooled beneath his gown. Not a trickle. A flood. Massive hemorrhage. Megan's hands moved before her conscious mind could complete the analysis, applying pressure, assessing the source. The bleeding was internal, systemic, pouring from somewhere beneath the surface. A shrapnel fragment that the imaging had missed. A piece of metal the size of a thumbnail that had worked loose during his recovery. She pulled the emergency alarm. Dr. Mercer arrived first, which meant he arrived frozen. His face went white as he understood what was happening. A patient he'd cleared, approved for discharge, was exsanguinating in front of him. The pressure was dropping, 85/50. Then 70/40. The monitor showed his heart racing to compensate, a desperate biological calculation that had maybe 4 minutes before failure. Jennifer Dawson was in the doorway, screaming. "Get surgery." "Now," Megan said. Her voice had shifted. The mask was gone. The words came out in military cadence, each one a command rather than a request. "There." Mercer's voice was thin, uncertain. "They're 20 minutes out." In another case. Megan looked at the crash cart. At Sergeant Dawson's graying face. At the blood pooling faster than any for could possibly replace it. At Jennifer Dawson's soundless scream in the doorway. She looked at her hands. The room went dead silent. "Someone get me a scalpel and rib spreaders. Now." 2 weeks after catching that embolism, Sergeant Dawson sat propped in his hospital bed like a man learning to breathe again. His color had returned. His vitals had stabilized. The catheter came out on day 9, and by day 14, he was walking the hallways with a physical therapist, his stride growing stronger each lap. Cedar Creek Medical had done its job. He was healing. Megan watched from the medication station as he passed, her eyes tracking him the way a sniper tracks a high-value target, not with aggression, but with absolute focus. She had been here for a reason when she arrived 3 months ago, and that reason was recovering soldiers. Intercepted chatter. A cell of extremists planning something bad. Something coordinated. Sergeant Dawson was one of 7 soldiers recovering in this facility, and she was supposed to monitor all of them. The investigation was still active. The threat was still real. The Army had placed her inside Cedar Creek Medical because this was where the attack was supposed to happen, and she couldn't blow her cover now, not when vulnerable men depended on her silence. The problem was Dr. Mercer. He saw something in her during that embolism save. Not respect. Suspicion. He'd been watching her more carefully since then, his eyes sharp with the kind of resentment that only festered in men who'd built their entire lives on hierarchy and saw it threatened. He didn't trust what she'd done. He didn't understand how a nurse could have that kind of clinical precision. And now he was hunting for proof that she'd overstepped. Megan continued her rounds, moving through Cedar Creek's hallways with the practiced invisibility of someone who'd spent her career not being looked at. She checked fours. She changed dressings. She took blood pressure readings and documented vital signs. Every movement was efficient, controlled, forgettable. She was getting good at being nobody. That was the whole point. But on day 18, something changed. Sergeant Dawson's scheduled dressing change was routine. Post-operative wound assessment, antibiotic ointment, fresh bandage. Megan had done it 4 times before. She was doing it again at 2:53 p.m. in the semi-private room on the orthopedic recovery floor, when his monitor started beeping in a pattern that made her entire nervous system light up like an electrical grid. His blood pressure dropped. Not slowly. Fast. 75. 68. 60. His heart rate climbed. 140. 158. 170. She looked down at the surgical site and understood immediately. The bleeding should have stopped weeks ago. But there it was, dark red seeping through the fresh dressing, the color of arterial blood, not venous. Heavy. Pooling. His eyes went wide. His breathing accelerated. The pain hit him like an ambush. "Get me Dr. Mercer," Megan said into the call button, her voice steady as a metronome. "Stat." She didn't wait for confirmation. She pulled the dressing back and saw the reason before anyone else did. A fragment of shrapnel, maybe 2 centimeters long, had remained embedded deeper than the surgical team had initially assessed. Something about his movement during physical therapy, or perhaps just the weight of his own healing body, had dislodged it. Now it was slicing through the pulmonary artery wall like a surgeon's blade making an incision that was never supposed to happen. Blood loss at this rate meant for minutes. Maybe 5. Cardiac arrest after that. Jenkins appeared in the doorway, pale. Reyes was right behind her. Dr. Mercer took 47 seconds to arrive, which felt like an hour. He looked at the bleeding, at Sergeant Dawson's white face, at the monitor climbing and climbing. He opened his mouth. Closed it. His hand moved toward the call button, as if remembering there was a protocol, a chain of command, something that required him to consult with someone more senior. He was trying to remember what he was supposed to do. The room needed action and Mercer was frozen solid, his jaw working silently like a man drowning on dry land. 3 seconds. That was all the time Megan allowed for his indecision. "I need an emergency thoracotomy kit," she said. Not asked. Her voice had dropped an octave. It came from somewhere deeper than her diaphragm. 14 gauge for the 4 line. 2 units of O-negative whole blood. Get the OR on standby, but we're opening him here. Now. Mercer stared at her. You absolutely will not. She was already moving. Scrubbing. Her hands moved with muscle memory from another life entirely, from sand and explosions and field tents where there was no time for permission. She pulled on sterile gloves and found the thoracotomy kit with her eyes closed, because she'd trained for exactly this scenario in exactly this kind of controlled chaos. Baghdad had taught her to work in the spaces between heartbeats. Retractor, she said. Jenkins handed it to her. Clamp. Suction. Pack that bleeder. Her hands were a machine. The scalpel went in at the 4th intercostal space, and the incision opened with terrible precision. The rib spreaders went in, metal on bone, a sound like a door being forced open, and she had access to the pulmonary artery before Sergeant Dawson's pressure hit 50. She could see the shrapnel fragment. Could see the artery wall opening like a mouth. She had 30 seconds to get a clamp on it before the bleeding became unsurvivable. The trembling didn't start until she was already moving. Her hands were steady as a surgical laser, but her breath shook. That was the only tell, the breath that came in precise, controlled intervals, the kind of breathing a person does when they're choosing courage instead of surrendering to panic. The clamp went on. Perfect placement. The bleeding stopped. Mercer stood useless against the wall, his face the color of old milk. Reyes's hands shook as she assisted. Jenkins kept the suction clear. Megan worked through Sergeant Dawson's open chest cavity like she'd done this 1,000 times before, which she had, just not in any hospital the staff could know about. She packed the bleeding point. She verified the clamp placement. She checked the pulse distal to the injury and felt it return like a second heartbeat beneath her fingertips. His pressure climbed. 80. 85. 90. Sinus rhythm. The surgical team arrived running, the attending surgeon named Cho entering like the room was already his. He stopped. He looked at the open chest. He looked at Megan's hands, still steady, still precise, still moving with the kind of authority that only came from experience he couldn't quantify. Who the hell did this? He whispered. Emergency room nurse, Megan said. She was stepping back now, becoming smaller, becoming the thing she'd trained herself to be. The trembling started in her hands now that the adrenaline was fading. Just a nurse. Just someone who happened to know military field surgery well enough to save a life when a surgeon froze. Just invisible again. Shrapnel fragment. Pulmonary artery. I clamped at point of injury. 2 units whole blood, pressure holding at 90. Cho moved in to take over, his hands going exactly where hers had been. His face said everything, he understood what he was looking at. He understood that no routine hospital nurse could perform a surgical emergency with this kind of precision. But he didn't say it. He just nodded and started calling orders. Megan stepped away from the bed and found the trash can to remove her gloves. Her hands trembled as she pulled them off, and she held them under the cold water at the sink, letting the freezing temperature do what willpower couldn't. The shaking was her body's way of saying it had just survived something. She'd kept her voice level. She'd kept her commands sharp. She'd kept her mind inside the moment instead of fracturing across all the ways this could go wrong. But inside her ribs, her heart was running like a prisoner that had just escaped its cage. Within 1 hour, Mercer made 3 phone calls. The hospital board president. The state nursing board. The legal counsel. Megan heard about it from Reyes, who overheard him in his office, voice tight and precise as a surgeon's blade. He was filing termination paperwork citing dangerous unauthorized procedures constituting gross negligence and practicing medicine without a license. He was reassigning Jenkins and Reyes to different floors effective immediately. He was altering the surgical schedule to exclude Megan from Sergeant Dawson's care. His strategy was surgical itself, removing witnesses, controlling the narrative, documenting a pattern of recklessness that would justify her removal and protect his own liability. The hospital administrator called her into HR at 5:06 p.m., just before shift change. Megan was still wearing her bloodstained scrubs. She hadn't had time to change. She walked into that office like a soldier walking toward a checkpoint, knowing there was going to be a problem but choosing to face it anyway. The administrator was sitting behind her desk, and her expression said she'd already been told the story from Mercer's angle. Mercer had called her first, painted the narrative with precision, made it all sound very reasonable and very damning. "We've received a formal complaint," the administrator began, sliding a document across the desk that Megan didn't touch. "Dr. Mercer is alleging that you performed surgical procedures outside your scope of practice without authorization. He's also suggesting that your credentials may not be what you represented during your hiring process." Megan could have explained. Could have told her about the thoracotomy, about the 4 minutes before cardiac arrest, about the shrapnel fragment that would have killed Sergeant Dawson if she'd waited for Mercer to unstick his feet from the floor. Could have said that sometimes the difference between a hero and a murderer was 30 seconds and someone willing to move. But if she did that, her cover was finished. The investigation would be compromised. The threat assessment would collapse. 7 soldiers would lose their protection, and whatever was being planned inside this city wouldn't be stopped. So she sat in that chair with her blood-stained scrubs and her steady hands and her absolutely motionless face, and she listened to the words that were ending her career before her son even knew she'd had one to end. The hospital was already rewriting its story. Within 1 hour of Megan's hands leaving Sergeant Dawson's open chest, Dr. Mercer sat in his office with the door locked and made 3 phone calls. The first went to Richard Bancroft, the hospital board chairman, a man whose family had donated the surgical wing in 1987 and who had not set foot inside Cedar Creek Medical since the ribbon cutting. Mercer's voice was calm, surgical, devoid of the rage that had frozen him at Dawson's bedside. He spoke about scope of practice. He spoke about liability. He spoke about a nurse who had performed a thoracotomy, a surgical procedure, Richard, a surgical procedure, without authorization, without supervision, without the credentials to make such a decision. By the time Mercer hung up, Bancroft had already made 2 calls of his own to the hospital administration. The second call went to Margaret Chen, the chief nursing officer. Mercer requested, with courteous firmness, that Megan be immediately removed from all trauma rotations pending an investigation. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that 2 nurses had witnessed the unauthorized procedure and might require counseling. By the time he disconnected, Margaret was already thinking about liability waivers and how to protect the hospital's accreditation. The third call was to his friend David Hastings at the State Medical Board, not to report Megan, but to establish a paper trail showing that Dr. James Mercer had immediately reported a dangerous breach of protocol, that he was the voice of reason in a room full of panic, that when a nurse overstepped her credentials and endangered a patient's life, it was he who had the professional judgment to contain the damage. By 4 p.m., the 2 nurses who had handed Megan instruments and called out vital signs during the thoracotomy were reassigned to pediatrics and the psychiatric ward respectively, rotations so incompatible with their expertise that one of them would resign within a month. Mercer made no announcement. He simply changed the schedule. It was strategic, surgical, the removal of witnesses performed with the precision of a man who had learned long ago that institutional power flows to those who understand how to weaponize policy. By 5 p.m., Sergeant Dawson's post-operative care was reassigned away from Megan's rotation. A trauma surgeon from another hospital system was being brought in for follow-up consultations, expensive, redundant, but necessary according to Mercer's memo, which cited continuity of care concerns and the need for independent evaluation following the unconventional field procedure. No one who read it understood that Mercer was simply cutting off her access, isolating her from the patient she'd saved, ensuring that she had no opportunity to check his stitches, monitor his recovery, or be anywhere near the evidence that her hands had held his life together when everyone else's had failed. By 6 p.m., the termination paperwork was on the desk of Jennifer Walsh, the HR director, each line written in Mercer's careful hand: unauthorized surgical intervention, practicing medicine outside her scope as a registered nurse, endangering patient life, falsifying her educational credentials. The accusation of fraud was the masterstroke, vague enough to be plausible, specific enough to trigger a full investigation that would take months to disprove, if she even fought it. Megan sat in the HR office at 6:38 p.m. with her hands folded on her lap, her blood-stained scrubs still clinging to her skin because security had escorted her directly from the surgical lounge before she could change. The blood wasn't hers. Most of it was Sergeant Dawson's. Some of it belonged to a man she had met 3 years ago in a compound outside Baghdad, a man who had promised her son's captain that he would keep the boy alive. Jennifer Walsh was a kind woman with tired eyes and a folder she couldn't quite meet Megan's gaze while reading. 11 minutes. That was how long it took to end a career. 11 minutes of HR policy and liability language and the gentle, bureaucratic language of institutional self-protection. Your actions, while undertaken under emergency circumstances, violated multiple safety protocols and exceeded your scope of practice as a registered nurse. Dr. Mercer has documented his concerns. The hospital is recommending immediate termination of your employment, effective immediately, pending the outcome of a formal investigation by the State Nursing Board. Megan did not defend herself. She could not. To explain that she'd served in Baghdad would invite questions. To mention her rank would trigger security protocols. To explain that she was here on a classified intelligence mission, monitoring a specific patient for information about a planned attack on recovering soldiers, would end the investigation and leave 7 other soldiers vulnerable to whoever was planning to use Sergeant Dawson as a connection point. Mercer knew none of this. He simply knew that a nurse had outperformed him, diagnosed what he'd missed, and saved a patient he was willing to let die rather than admit his own failure. "Do you have anything you'd like to say?" Jennifer asked, and her voice carried genuine regret, the sound of someone caught between compassion and institutional machinery. Megan looked down at her bag, at the small folded flag pinned to the front, not fabric, but metal, hammered and shaped from shrapnel and aircraft wreckage, a memorial to a medic named Garrett who had died in her arms at a forward operating base outside Fallujah. Her son had never met Garrett. Her son would never know that the captain he trusted with his life had once trusted a woman in scrubs to hold that flag and remember. She thought of Sergeant Dawson's wife's face when Mercer had dressed her down in front of the patient's terrified family. She thought of her boy in Baghdad, wearing a uniform with a patch on the shoulder that meant he belonged to someone else now, that his mother's job was no longer to protect him but to trust other people to do it. "I understand," Megan said, and her voice was steady and empty, the voice of someone whose composure had become a kind of armor so heavy she could barely move under its weight. They walked her to her locker. Security stood 3 feet away, hands relaxed but present. She pulled down her work shoes, black leather, broken in at the heel, and shoved them into a plastic bag alongside her scrubs. The folded flag she left where it was, pinned to the inside of the locker door where only she would see it. Some things did not belong in the world of hospitals and forms and institutional failures. By 8 p.m. she was sitting in a diner called the Graveyard Shift on the edge of Norfolk, the kind of place that served coffee at 3 in the morning to nurses coming off night shifts and cops running on fumes and people who had nowhere else to be. She'd been there since 10 p.m. the night before. No, that wasn't right. Time had stopped somewhere between the OR and Jennifer's office and now she was somewhere else entirely. Hours had passed or maybe minutes, and her coffee had gone cold in its ceramic cup, and the fluorescent lights above her head buzzed with the sound of equipment failing slowly, and she stared at her reflection in the window beside her booth and did not recognize the woman looking back. Hollow-eyed. That was what people said about soldiers who'd seen things. Hollow-eyed and distant and carrying a weight that showed itself in how they held their shoulders. Megan's reflection had the same look, the same absence behind the eyes, the same sense that something essential had been extracted and left empty space behind. Her phone had 17 missed calls from the Pentagon number she could never call back in public, not from a diner, not from anywhere her voice could be overheard and recorded and traced. A classified number that only rang in emergencies or when operations collapsed. She had a dead drop location 7 blocks away where she was supposed to leave information. She had a handler who was probably losing his mind trying to figure out what had happened in Cedar Creek Medical that would make a CIA asset blow her own cover by performing unauthorized surgery in front of witnesses. Her son had texted her at 5:44 p.m., right around the time Mercer was making his 3rd phone call. "Sarge says you saved his life today. He wants to recommend you for commendation. Mom, I'm so proud of you." She had not responded. She did not know how to respond. How do you tell your son that the thing he's proud of you for is the thing that just ended your career? How do you explain that you were never supposed to be visible, never supposed to be a hero, never supposed to be anything except a ghost moving through the hospital with steady hands and a classified security clearance? How do you tell a 17-year-old boy that his commanding officer's promise to keep him safe just got a lot harder because the operative monitoring that promise just got fired for saving the man's life? A drunk couple was arguing in a booth behind her? Something about a promise. Something about betrayal. The woman's voice was high and sharp and breaking. The man's was low and tired and done trying. Megan pulled out a paper napkin from the dispenser on the table and pressed it to her eyes without letting herself cry. The tears came anyway, silent and efficient, the way everything in her life was supposed to work, without witnesses, without sound, without anyone knowing that the machine was breaking down inside. She touched the rim of her cold coffee cup. She thought about Garrett's flag, folded and waiting in her locker. She thought about her son's boots as he'd marched away 6 months ago, thought about the promise she'd made to his commanding officer, thought about the 7 soldiers she'd been tasked with identifying, 7 soldiers who were probably going to be vulnerable now, probably going to be exposed, probably going to die because she'd made an impossible choice and chosen to be human instead of choosing to be a mission. The bell above the diner door chimed. Megan did not look up. She knew who it would be before the door opened. She'd spent 3 years learning to read the angle of approach, the weight distribution in a person's gait, the microsecond before they committed to motion. A delivery driver, probably, the way the person moved with the efficiency of someone who had done this route 1,000 times. She looked back at her reflection in the window. At the hollow eyes. At the hands that had held a human heart and made it beat again, and then had been bound behind her back by bureaucracy and institutional failure and the terrible weight of classified information that could not be shared to save her own career. She whispered to her reflection, barely audible, "I'm sorry." The reflection did not answer. It never did. But somewhere in the pre-dawn hours, as Megan sat in that diner with her cold coffee and her ruined career, something was moving through the world with a velocity and purpose that neither she nor Dr. Mercer could have anticipated. Her son was making phone calls. Sergeant Dawson was making requests from his hospital bed. And somewhere in a Pentagon building, a 2-star general was reading a classified briefing about an operative named Phantom 6 whose cover had just been blown and whose sacrifice might have just saved more than one man's life. By morning, everything would change. Her 17-year-old son burst through the Cedar Creek Medical lobby doors at 7:43 a.m., moving with a kind of controlled urgency that meant military training was already taking root. His dress uniform was pressed sharp enough to draw blood. The medal case in his hands caught the fluorescent light like an accusation. Behind him, the morning shift stopped what they were doing. Clipboards lowered. Conversations died. The lobby air felt like it did before a storm, that strange pressure shift that made your ears pop. "Mom." His voice cracked once, then steadied. "They need to see these." Megan turned from the supply closet where she'd been mechanically restocking glove boxes, moving through the hospital like a ghost who'd forgotten she was dead. She'd been fired 18 hours ago. She wasn't supposed to be here. But the uniform, her dress blues, hung in her locker like a secret she'd kept locked away for so long that even she'd stopped believing in it. Her son held up the medal case. Gold embossed. Official. Inside, 3 military medals caught the light with the kind of shine that only combat service produces. The staff began to gather. A nurse named Chen. 2 residents whose names she'd never learned. The unit secretary who'd avoided her since Mercer's campaign started. They moved toward the sound like iron filings pulled by a magnet. Sergeant Dawson wheeled himself out of his room on the 3rd floor, drawn by the commotion that rippled through the hospital like sonar. He'd been stable for 6 hours now. Vitals solid. Color returning to his face. He rolled to the stair rail and looked down at the gathering below, at the teenage boy in dress uniform holding a medal case, at the woman in scrubs staring at her own hands like they belonged to someone else. His voice came out hoarse from the breathing tube trauma, but it carried across the silence like a rifle shot. Phantom 6. He said it like a prayer. Like recognition. Like remembrance. That's her call sign. From Baghdad. Jesus Christ, that's Phantom 6. The Marine Corps liaison had been visiting another patient, a lieutenant colonel with a spinal fracture scheduled for Walter Reed transfer. He heard the name and moved toward it the way soldiers move toward anything that smells like Valor. He was a tall man with a kind of posture that made doorways seem too small. He took the medal case from Megan's son with careful hands. His voice, when he read from Megan's official citation, sounded like someone reading scripture in a language everyone understood. Captain Megan O'Brien, Bronze Star with Valor, for sustained operations under enemy fire while providing emergency trauma care to coalition forces during Operation Iraqi Freedom, 2009 through 2012. Commended for extraordinary medical competence and tactical decision-making in combat environments resulting in 47 documented lives saved. 47. The number hung in the air like a physical thing. The doors to the North Corridor opened. A 2-star general was being escorted by administration, some kind of routine transfer assessment. He saw the gathering. He saw the dress uniform on the teenage boy. He saw the medals. Something in his face shifted, that recognition that comes from a lifetime recognizing rank and service and sacrifice. He walked directly to Megan, extended his hand to his chest, and saluted her with a precision that made the air itself seem to stand at attention. "Captain," he said simply. Nothing else. No questions. Just respect offered like a formal weapon. The elevator chimed. Dr. Mercer stepped out into the lobby around 7:13 a.m., his usual morning coffee, black, expensive, from the cafe 3 blocks away, in his hand. He'd spent the night preparing documentation for the board meeting. Megan's firing was solid. Airtight. The false record he'd constructed would hold because no one questioned physicians the way they questioned nurses. He'd had 15 years of experience perfecting that particular truth. He saw the gathering. He saw the medals. He saw the general salute. Something in his brain refused to process what he was seeing, the way a system refuses to accept data that contradicts its fundamental programming. He pushed into the crowd, his coffee forgotten, his voice already climbing into that register that had silenced nurses and intimidated residents for nearly 3 decades. This is absurd. His words came out sharp and flattened, the way a blade sounds when you drag it across concrete. These are fabricated. She's a fraud. I have documentation proving. The 2 Pentagon officials came through the main entrance at precisely 7:48 a.m., moving with the economical precision of people who'd never wasted emotion in their lives. Their ID badges didn't match hospital credentials. Their suits fit the way suits fit when they came from someone who understood that appearance was a weapon. Captain O'Brien? The first one, a woman with steel-gray eyes and silver hair pulled back so tight it looked like it might hurt, moved directly past Mercer without acknowledging he existed. "We need you to come with us. There's a secure line from the administrator's office. The Pentagon wants a full brief on the Baghdad intelligence assessment you compiled." The room didn't just go silent. It collapsed into a specific kind of silence, the kind that happens when the entire foundation of a narrative shifts beneath everyone's feet simultaneously. Mercer's face went the color of hospital walls. His mouth opened. Closed. The coffee cup trembled in his hand, a dark liquid earthquake contained by ceramic. He understood, in that moment, that he'd been wrong about everything. Not the kind of wrong you recover from with better documentation or a stronger email. The kind of wrong that rewrites history. Megan looked at her son. She looked at Sergeant Dawson, alive in a wheelchair because of her hands. She looked at the general, still standing at attention like respect was something he owed rather than something he was offering. Then she turned to the Pentagon officers. "I'm ready," she said. 10 words. Simple. Complete. They escorted her toward the administrator's office, her son following in his pressed uniform like a soldier shadowing a legend. Behind them, the hospital staff stood frozen in the lobby, watching the timid nurse with the haunted eyes transform into someone else entirely. The voice that had been soft and deferential for 18 hours had dropped an octave. The hands that had trembled during Mercer's initial campaign were steady. The woman who'd sat alone in a diner at 3 a.m. wondering if she'd failed was walking toward a secure Pentagon line like she'd been expecting it. By 48 hours later, the hospital visitor's phone footage had been shared 2.3 million times across social media. The video was titled, "Dr. Berates Decorated War Hero Nurse, Watch His Face When He Finds Out." It showed Mercer's patient room tirade from the day before, his voice rising, his finger pointing, his accusation that Meghan had falsified credentials, cut against footage of the Marine Corps liaison reading her Bronze Star citation. Cut against the general's salute. Cut against her son in dress uniform holding the medal case with both hands like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. In the video, you could see the moment it hit Mercer. The second his brain processed that every humiliation he'd orchestrated, every public mockery, every systematic campaign to isolate her had been directed at someone who'd spent 3 years under deep cover protecting American soldiers while he was reviewing hospital policy manuals. His face went from angry red to a white so complete it looked like all his blood had decided to flee simultaneously. The nurses watching him seemed to age backwards into relief. The hospital board called an emergency meeting. Jenkins and Reyes gave formal statements about being reassigned immediately after the emergency. They provided dates, times, Mercer's explicit instruction to keep their mouths shut about what they saw or transfer requests would be denied. The surgical schedule alterations were documented. The termination paperwork was flagged as procedurally irregular because it had been filed before the incident was even fully reported. But the killing blow came from somewhere Mercer couldn't defend against, couldn't discredit, couldn't argue with institutional authority. Dr. Harrison Weymouth, retired Army trauma surgeon, former chief of military medicine, Mercer's own medical school mentor, the man who'd written letters of recommendation that got Mercer his positions, released a public statement to the Journal of the American Medical Association, the New England Journal of Medicine, and every major medical board in the country. "I am horrified and ashamed that a physician I trained could demonstrate such contempt for a decorated combat veteran and skilled nurse. Captain O'Brien's tactical decisions in Baghdad saved lives. Her diagnosis at Cedar Creek saved Sergeant Dawson's life. And Dr. Mercer's systematic campaign against her was motivated by professional jealousy and institutional misogyny. I disown my former protégé and demand a full board investigation into his conduct, both in this case and in any prior interactions with female nursing staff. The medical profession must examine how we allow physicians like this one to thrive while we drive out the competent women who threaten their ego." Weymouth's name carried weight. He'd trained half the military surgeons in active service. His ethics were unimpeachable. His statement made it impossible for Mercer to hide behind institutional protection. The board investigation took 72 hours. They found 6 other nurses over 15 years. All competent. All driven out quietly. All of them women. They found Mercer's altered documentation on Meghan's case. They found his attempt to interfere with Sergeant Dawson's care during the emergency thoracotomy by questioning her procedure choices mid-operation, mid-crisis, when one moment of hesitation could have cost her life. Show Mercer sitting in his office on a Wednesday afternoon at 1:41 p.m. His attorney across from him, explaining options in the neutral tone of someone who'd delivered bad news so many times it had become a texture rather than information. Resign immediately with a severance agreement that prevents him from practicing medicine in Virginia, or face formal termination and license review that could result in permanent revocation across all 50 states. His hand shook. His phone buzzed with the sound of colleagues cancelling lunches, universities cancelling seminars, the Columbia University guest lecture series, 12 years running, cancelled immediately. His wife's car was in the driveway when he came home at 2 p.m. on a Wednesday. She was upstairs, packing. 31 years of marriage, and she decided it would end not with a conversation but with suitcases and the sound of the spare bedroom closet being emptied. He signed the resignation letter at 3:14 p.m. 28 years of career. Erasure. A pen stroke. 6 weeks later, the White House East Room filled with military brass and press cameras. Captain Megan O'Brien stood in dress blues, her service record displayed in medals that caught the light like captured history. The Bronze Star. The Silver Star. 2 Purple Hearts. Her son stood beside her in his own new Army uniform. He'd enlisted the day after the hospital reveal, the same day his mother had walked out of Cedar Creek Medical with Pentagon officers flanking her like a security detail made of institutional power. The president awarded her a Presidential Citizen's Medal for exemplary service both in combat and in continuing to protect American soldiers under deep cover assignment at great personal cost. The citation mentioned Cedar Creek Medical by name, confirming her mission, making public what had been classified. Sergeant Dawson stood in the audience, alive. Alive because of her hands. Alive because she'd known something was wrong with his diagnosis. Alive because she'd been willing to destroy her cover to save him. Mrs. Dawson held a homemade sign, "Our Hero." Her hands trembled as she held it. Not from weakness. From gratitude so complete it had nowhere else to go. Megan wore a small pin on her lapel beneath her military ribbons, made from her fallen teammate's folded flag. The one she'd kept in her locker at Cedar Creek for 3 years. The flag of someone who hadn't made it home. Who wouldn't make it home? Who'd given everything so people like Sergeant Dawson could live long enough to be saved by someone like her. And in Norfolk, basement classroom of the community college, fluorescent lights flickering like they were tired, Dr. Mercer taught CPR to bored teenagers for $15 an hour. His voice monotone as he demonstrated chest compressions on a plastic dummy. A student scrolled through her phone, watching Megan's White House ceremony live-streamed on her social media feed. She didn't realize her instructor was in the background of the story being told. Another story about authority failing and being held accountable. She whispered to her friend, that doctor was such a tool. Mercer's jaw tightened. But he said nothing. The silence was its own kind of punishment. Back at the White House, Megan stepped to the microphone. She looked at her son. At Sergeant Dawson. At the flag pin beneath her ribbons. At the general who'd saluted her in a Norfolk hospital lobby and meant every angle of it. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. Every nurse who shows up for a night shift, every medic who runs toward danger, every person who saves a life and goes home in silence, you are the real heroes. I just had the honor of being seen. The room rose in applause. The kind of applause that sounds like recognition finally finding its target. Megan and her son walked out of the White House together, his arm around her shoulders, her slight limp still visible but her head held high. Behind them, Sergeant Dawson moved in his wheelchair, Mrs. Dawson pushing with a kind of care that meant permanence, meant gratitude that would last a lifetime, meant knowing exactly who'd been worth saving and why. If you've ever been underestimated by someone in authority who couldn't see your actual value, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Comment below, have you ever worked under someone who felt threatened by competent women? And if you know a real-world Megan, a quiet hero holding things together while someone else takes credit, tag them. Let's start seeing the people who save lives instead of just the people who take the credit.